There was tension in the air long before Clint Eastwood stepped foot on Jimmy Kimmel's stage that night. It was supposed to be just another high-profile interview, one of those late-night segments where legends of the screen come in, crack a few jokes, share stories from decades past, and gracefully exit to roaring applause. But Eastwood, even at his age, was never the kind of man to follow a script unless it was his own. What unfolded that evening would go on to divide public opinion, dominate headlines, and shake up the seemingly bulletproof reputation of a beloved talk show host. From the beginning, there was a certain sharpness in Clint's eyes, the kind that only a man who has seen too much nonsense can muster. He had come onto the show to promote a quiet documentary project, something deeply personal, reflective, and built around the values of resilience and silence in the modern world. It was a far cry from the explosive films that had made him a legend, but it was his latest work, and it mattered to him. Jimmy, on the other hand, had other plans for the conversation. Just moments into the sit-down, Jimmy's tone turned mocking. Instead of engaging with the substance of Clint's film, he chose to poke fun at Eastwood's age, his past political views, and even the supposed irrelevance of a slow-paced documentary in a time dominated by viral clips and cheap laughs. At first, Clint tried to brush it off. He gave that famous squint, leaned back in his seat, and calmly attempted to steer the conversation back to the reason he was there. But Jimmy, feeding off the audience's laughter, kept pushing. What made it worse was the clear imbalance in respect. Jimmy seemed more interested in crafting a viral moment than having a real conversation. He interrupted Clint mid-thought, twisted his words for comedic effect, and even played old clips from Clint's younger years in a way that felt more mocking than nostalgic. The crowd, confused but trained to laugh on cue, went along with it, and then it happened. Jimmy made a remark that crossed a line, not one etched in politics or opinions, but a deeply personal jab at Clint's relevance as a filmmaker in the modern world. It was phrased like a joke, but everyone in the room felt the shift. The studio fell silent for a beat too long. Clint's face didn't change much, but the look in his eyes did. The host had gone too far, and for the first time in the segment, the power dynamic shifted. Clint leaned forward. His voice didn't rise. His expression didn't explode into rage, but his words cut with the weight of a man who had built a lifetime on discipline and dignity. The audience, still unsure whether to laugh or gasp, sat frozen. Jimmy, visibly caught off guard, attempted to recover with another joke, but it landed flat. There was no energy behind it, no confidence, only the awkward chuckle of a man realizing he had underestimated the guest seated beside him. From that point on, the interview spiraled into something else entirely. Clint refused to play along. He took control of the conversation with a quiet authority that silenced the room. He spoke not just about his film, but about the erosion of respect in modern media, the obsession with instant entertainment over real substance, and the arrogance of those who wield platforms without understanding the weight of their words. Each statement landed heavier than the last. Jimmy tried to salvage the moment with humor, but the laughter was gone. The crowd was watching history unfold, not the collapse of Clint Eastwood, but the unraveling of a host who had mistaken charm for control. By the end of the segment, Clint had managed to shift the energy of the entire show. He stood up before the commercial break, gave a polite nod to the crowd, and walked off set without waiting for the usual closing remarks. Jimmy, still seated and fumbling with his note cards, stared into the camera with a forced smile that couldn't mask the unease settling behind his eyes. The clip would soon be all over the internet, but not for the reasons Jimmy had hoped. The fallout began before Clint even left the building. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to figure out how to handle the moment. Jimmy, now off camera and pacing in the hallway, was visibly shaken. What had been intended as a light-hearted jab had turned into a televised reckoning, and everyone could feel it. The studio's energy had curdled into something cold and uncertain. Staff avoided eye contact, assistants whispered in corners, and the show's director, known for keeping a tight grip on flow, stood frozen, reviewing the footage with a grim expression. As Clint quietly exited through a side door with his assistant, trailing behind, he didn't stop to offer farewells or engage in small talk. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. In the hallway, a few of the younger staff members looked up, their expressions caught between admiration and discomfort. They had witnessed something rare, an unfiltered clash between generations, between what entertainment used to be and what it had become. Clint gave them a nod, not out of politeness, but acknowledgement. He could sense they understood more than they let on. Within hours, clips from the show began circulating online. But this time, it wasn't Jimmy Kimmel's usual brand of viral content that captured the spotlight. Instead, viewers latched onto Clint's quiet takedown of the entire late-night format. People weren't sharing the jokes. They were sharing the silence, the tension. The way Clint had dismantled a smug grin with nothing more than controlled words and calm presence. It wasn't anger that resonated. It was dignity. Comment sections exploded. Thousands chimed in, many expressing their disappointment in Jimmy's behavior, while others defended him as just doing his job. But it was clear which way the public was leaning. Clint had struck a nerve, not just with Jimmy, but with an audience that was growing tired of shallow performances disguised as interviews. For many, it wasn't just about that night's show. It was about what had been lost over the years: depth, authenticity, and respect. Meanwhile, Jimmy faced a different storm. Internally, executives from the network reached out, urging him to address the incident before it spiraled further. Advertisers, too, made quiet calls, asking how the show planned to recover. Ratings were still strong, but momentum was fragile, and the network knew it. Jimmy, for the first time in years, felt exposed. Not just as a host, but as a man whose charm had shielded him from real consequence until now. In his dressing room, Jimmy sat alone watching the playback. Over and over, he replayed the moment. Clint's demeanor shifted. He watched the crowd go silent. He watched his own jokes fall flat, his laughter trailing into nothing. It was the kind of footage that stripped away illusion. It wasn't just a misstep, it was a mirror. And he didn't like what he saw. Outside, Clint was already on his way back to the hotel. He had no intention of issuing a public statement. In his mind, the moment had passed. He had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. But as he sat by the window of the car, watching the city lights flicker by, he could feel something larger taking shape. This wasn't just about one host or one night. It was a reflection of a deeper issue. How voices of substance were drowned out by noise. How reverence had been traded for ridicule. What Clint hadn't anticipated, however, was just how loud that silence would become. The next morning, major news outlets were already analyzing the confrontation. Opinion pieces flooded social media feeds. Television pundits debated whether Jimmy had crossed a line or simply met his match. And while some tried to reduce the moment to a clash of egos, those who had watched closely knew better. This wasn't about pride. It was about principle. Celebrities began to weigh in. Some of Clint's longtime peers voiced their support, applauding him for standing his ground. A few of Jimmy's fellow late-night hosts, carefully watching the reaction, remained quiet, unsure whether to defend him or distance themselves. The public had taken a side, and that made things dangerous. For Clint, the controversy was a reminder that truth, even when spoken softly, can echo louder than scripted applause. And for Jimmy, it was the beginning of a reckoning he couldn't joke his way out of. By midweek, the weight of the moment had fully settled on Jimmy's shoulders. The previous few days had been a whirlwind of spin control, public relations drafts, and internal meetings behind closed doors. The network urged him to smooth things over, maybe invite Clint back, or issue a playful statement to downplay the event. But Jimmy knew it wasn't that simple. The silence Clint left behind on that stage had become more deafening with each passing day. People weren't just discussing. What happened? They were dissecting what it meant. The culture around late-night television was shifting. Viewers were no longer content with superficial back-and-forths wrapped in canned laughter. They craved something genuine, something rooted in thoughtfulness, and Clint, in an unplanned confrontation, had managed to expose the gap between what the audience truly wanted and what the show had been feeding them. Jimmy found himself at the center of that tension, no longer the clever host with the upper hand, but the man who had underestimated a guest and paid the price on live television. As the days went on, the pressure mounted. Network producers drafted a possible apology, but Jimmy hesitated. He wrestled with pride, the fear of looking weak, and the creeping realization that maybe, just maybe, Clint had been right. Not about everything, but about the shallow direction the industry had taken, and the arrogance of hosts like himself, who believed cleverness was more powerful than sincerity. Then came the letter. It wasn't made public, and it wasn't written for the cameras. It arrived quietly, handwritten, sealed in a plain envelope, delivered to the network's front desk with no fanfare. It was from Clint. The staff, curious but respectful, handed it off to Jimmy's assistant, who gave it to him without comment. Jimmy read it alone in his office, slowly, twice through. There was no apology, no accusation, no attempt to escalate the situation. Instead, it was a letter shaped by clarity and calm. Clint had simply laid out what he believed to be the core of the issue. Not between the two of them as individuals, but between the worlds they represented. A world where reflection had weight, and one where performance took precedence. Clint wrote about legacy, about the responsibility of having a platform, and about the cost of chasing laughs over truth. For Jimmy, it was a gut punch, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. He folded the letter and sat in silence for several minutes. That night, he made a decision. The next episode opened differently. Gone were the flashing graphics and pre-show antics. The music faded sooner, and Jimmy walked out to a set stripped of its usual energy. The audience was there, but the vibe had changed. He stood before the camera and spoke, not to entertain, but to address. There was no cue card, no teleprompter, just a man, uncomfortable, but trying. He admitted that the interview had gone wrong, that his attempts at humor had fallen flat, and that he hadn't given Clint Eastwood the respect he deserved. More importantly, he acknowledged that the incident had taught him something he hadn't expected to learn so late in his career. About listening, about restraint, about what people actually valued when they tuned in. The crowd sat in respectful silence. It was the most subdued moment the show had ever seen, but it was also the most real. Whether it was enough to heal the wound remained to be seen, but for once, Jimmy wasn't trying to fix things with charm. He was owning it. Meanwhile, Clint remained out of the spotlight. He didn't respond to Jimmy's statement, nor did he attend the slew of interview invitations that followed. His silence continued to speak louder than any media blitz could have. He had said what he needed to say, not through a press release, but by simply refusing to play along with the spectacle. While many fans applauded Jimmy's statement, others believed it was too late. Some felt it was a calculated move to protect his career, not a genuine moment of reflection. The divide in public opinion mirrored a deeper fracture in the entertainment world itself, between those clinging to the past and those craving something more meaningful. What Clint had done, perhaps unintentionally, was pull back the curtain. And once people had seen what was behind it, they could not unsee it. The days that followed Jimmy's on-air admission marked a strange shift in the atmosphere surrounding both men. For Jimmy, it was as if the act of stepping out from behind the curtain had partially redeemed him, but not completely. The public was no longer laughing along as passively as before. Every future joke, every interview segment was now under quiet scrutiny. There was a tension beneath the laughter, a pause before applause, as though the audience was trying to decide whether it was still appropriate to play along. Yet something else was beginning to happen. Rather than spiral into self-pity or fade into apology mode, Jimmy took the incident as a wake-up call. He started changing the show's tone. Guests were allowed more breathing room. Conversations turned less performative, more exploratory. Monologues focused less on mockery, more on nuance. And slowly, very slowly, the audience began to lean in again, not out of habit, but out of genuine interest. Clint, meanwhile, remained absent from the media storm. He continued to attend private screenings for his documentary, accepting warm but modest praise in independent circles. There were no social media posts, no staged interviews. It wasn't out of spite or aloofness. He simply had no interest in turning a genuine moment into a spectacle. But even in his absence, his influence grew. Industry insiders began referring to the Eastwood effect, the idea that substance had made a sudden, quiet comeback, that maybe the public was tired of being entertained and hungry for something that made them think. A ripple effect swept across the industry. Talk show hosts who had once prided themselves on dominance now began inviting guests with more humility. Clips that trended weren't always the ones with the biggest laughs, but the ones where guests said something vulnerable or hosts admitted fault. It was a strange moment in entertainment, as if the curtain had been permanently altered, and the audience no longer trusted what was behind it without a second glance. Behind the scenes, network executives reached out to Clint's representatives more than once. They offered him a prime slot to return, even without Jimmy present. They wanted a sit-down, a special, something to reframe the moment in their favor. Clint refused every offer. For him, the matter was closed. It had never been about revenge, ratings, or reclaiming fame. It was about standing for something that had long been buried beneath the noise. The message had already been delivered, and there was no need to repeat it, but not everyone was ready to let it go. In one of the more unpredictable turns, an upcoming awards show invited Clint to receive a Lifetime Achievement honor, hoping to ride the wave of his renewed cultural presence. He declined once. They pushed again. This time, his team negotiated that if he were to accept it, he would do so under one condition: no elaborate speeches, no performances, and absolutely no commentary from comedians. Just a quiet, dignified moment of acknowledgement. They agreed. When the night came, Clint walked onto the stage to an audience standing in silence. There was no orchestra swelling beneath him, no lights blinding his every step. Just him, under a single spotlight, holding the award in one hand. He didn't give a speech. He simply looked across the crowd, nodded once, and walked away. That image, stark, dignified, and unshaken, was broadcast across every major outlet, and for many, it cemented what the confrontation with Jimmy had already confirmed. That authenticity, when delivered without ego or showmanship, carries a weight no production can replicate. Back on his own set, Jimmy watched the moment unfold. On a muted screen in his office, he leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching the man he had once tried to reduce to a punchline. But there was no bitterness now, no resentment, only a quiet respect and a deep sense of understanding. The industry had changed, and whether Jimmy liked it or not, Clint Eastwood had been the one to light the fuse. As the weeks turned into months, the moment between Clint Eastwood and Jimmy Kimmel faded from the front pages, but its impact lingered beneath the surface. It was no longer just a viral clip or a headline passed around for entertainment. It had become a quiet turning point, a reference point for something deeper, something that had shifted the tone of public conversation. Jimmy, once defined by his ability to dominate interviews through wit and sarcasm, had subtly reinvented himself. His show no longer chased cheap viral moments. The laughs still came, but now they shared space with silences, thoughtful pauses, and an unexpected level of sincerity. In one interview with a young filmmaker, he paused mid-segment and allowed the guest to finish a point uninterrupted. A small act that seemed insignificant to most, but those who had watched the Eastwood clash recognized the evolution. He never returned to his old format entirely. That version of Jimmy had been left on the stage the night Clint walked off. And yet, despite all the growth, the apology, and the professional course correction, there was one final echo left in the story. Months after the incident, during a rare sit-down for a public discussion on storytelling in modern America, Clint was asked by a moderator, without prompting or lead-up, if he would ever return to Jimmy's show. The audience leaned in, hungry for drama, for a final comment to close the loop. Clint sat for a long moment before answering. His face was unreadable, his tone steady. He didn't confirm or deny. He simply said that dignity was not a performance, and when it becomes one, it loses all value. The audience, unsure how to respond, remained silent, but that response, measured, firm, and unshakably Eastwood, became the final word. It was not lost on Jimmy. Back in his own world, Jimmy continued to evolve, but he never sought to invite Clint back, not out of fear or resentment, but because he understood now what that moment had been about. It had never been about mending a public rift. It had been about looking in the mirror and not flinching. He kept Clint's letter, folded and worn, tucked in the drawer of his desk as a reminder that every platform, every audience, and every moment of airtime came with a cost. And more importantly, with responsibility. In an unexpected way, Clint had given Jimmy something few ever could: clarity. It came at a price, but it came with value. Years later, when the memory of the clash had faded from headlines but still floated around in cultural memory, people would recall it not as a scandal or a controversy, but as a rare moment where someone stood his ground with calm certainty in a world drowning in performance, and not through shouting, outrage, or spectacle, but through quiet force. For Clint Eastwood, it was never about proving anything. It was about holding a line most had long abandoned. And for Jimmy Kimmel, it was about realizing there had been a line in the first place. In a world of noise, one man's silence had changed everything. And whether anyone admitted it or not, the entire industry still moved differently because of it.